There are forces bigger than us that have had huge impacts on who we are. Some of these are things like individualism, technology, and the slow life strategy. Well, last time we looked into how the number one expert saw these factors impact past generations, but we left off one big one, and that's our generation. So let's look into it. Over the past couple of videos, we've been looking into Jean Twenge, who is widely known as the number one expert when it comes to generations. We've talked about different aspects as far as her theories and how she got into things, but today we're looking into Gen Z and her thoughts on the traits of Gen Z and how the big factors we talked about in my intro have impacted us across time. Well, the first one we're going to talk about is gender fluidity. What do I mean by that? Well, among Gen Z, there's been many, and not all Gen Z, let me first say that, not all Gen Z, because as we'll get into later, there's a lot of political polarization across Gen Z. But among many versus the millennials, there's been a redefinition of what gender is. So you might have heard a comment like gender is the cultural expression of sex, that it's really that the biggest difference is the expression of yourself, whereas sex is something biological, gender is something you express. And that's an interesting point of view. Like I said, many people think that way. However, she points that out as one more reason, one more effect of individualism on our lives. Let me explain that why that is, because at first glance it might not seem like individualism would affect how you think about gender, but it really does in some big ways. Because if you live in a more collectivistic culture, a culture where you care more about how everyone else thinks about you, well, how are you going to react? How are you going to express yourself? Well, it's not going to matter as much what's inside, how you feel. Because what you're thinking about, what you value, is how other people around you think, what they value. And so therefore gender will become very much about other people, about expressing how other people think you should act, how other people think that you should be. Now, in a more individualistic culture, a culture that she thinks we become more and more as time has progressed, leading up into Gen Z, well, in a culture like that, then what's inside matters most. How you express yourself should come from the inside out. It should come from who you really are. It should come from the deeper parts of yourself. And she sees gender fluidity as an expression of this difference, of people looking inside and how they feel, what they think, their traits, their personality, and seeing, does that match my conception of my sex, of the gender that I'm supposed to be, and then applying that going forward. That's how she looks at it, and then she traces this trend along with individualism. Well, furthermore, the next trait we're going to talk about is more identification as being other than straight. Now, let's talk about this in a little more depth. Over the course of time, there's been a lot of different surveys that have been given to people. Now, why is this important? Well, if you just look at one survey that's given to Gen Z at any given time, that's not going to be as important or as valuable as something that is given to the same cohort, to the same group of people at different age groups. Meaning, we look back at millennials. If millennial 18-year-olds were asked the same questions that Gen Z 18-year-olds were, that boomer 18-year-olds were, that Gen X 18-year-old, and on, well, then you can start to see some really interesting data, some really interesting facts. And some of these surveys have come up with more identification as being other than straight. Well, there's some interesting facts about this. One is there has been some uptick among gay men and women. However, the most uptick has been with bisexual women, identifying more as bisexual. And again, we can trace this back to her concept of individualism, of people being more free to fully express who they are, versus an era where if you did have feelings for women, you tamped that down and didn't think about them, didn't want to talk about them. You wanted to fit the mold that society had given you. So that's one of the ways that she sees that. Also, she also draws this concept of female sexuality being a little bit more fluid than male sexuality, and she references some anthropologists. I believe one of them was Roy Baumeister, who's also a psychologist as well, and how he talks about how female sexuality is a bit more fluid, a bit more malleable. So these are some factors that she says to explain this, but as a trait, it's still very interesting to know. The next trait we're going to talk about is less sexual activity. And this is related, if not a little bit different, it is a little bit different than the last two that we talked about. However, I think it's still super interesting to group as three. And I believe this is the same order that she has in the book, too. So, why is this something that's interesting? Well, a lot of Christians, a lot of conservatives, a lot of people who are more traditionalist, they look at people who are of the LGBT community as being really about sex, as it really is about sexuality. It's about who you're attracted to. It's not much more than that. It's not much deeper than that. However, Gen Z somewhat changes this notion. They really put a stop on this idea. Why? Because at the same time that gender fluidity is going up and more lesbian, bisexual, and gay people are identifying as such, while at the same time, the actual sexual contact is lower. So if you thought that they were the same, they would go up together, but yet they're not. And that is a big difference with Gen Z. Gen Z, on the other hand, she points to things like digital media, to phones and social media as reasons why we might not be as sexually active. But another big one she talks about is the next trait, and that is growing up more slowly. Well, in past ages and past decades, a lot of the milestones that would mark you as being of maturity, of adulthood, things like going on your first date, going to prom, losing your virginity, graduating high school, going to college, getting your first job. A lot of them, in actuality, have happened when Gen Z is older, when Zoomers are older, rather than it being something that happens when you're 16 or you're 15, you get your first job. For many members of Gen Z, it's when they're older, when they're more like 18, 19, or 20. And why is this interesting? Or why does that have anything to do with less sexual activity? Well, part of the difference could be because we're just growing up more slowly. A lot of the milestones that past generations had, like a girlfriend, like sexual contact, are just happening for us at a slower rate. So that could be something that's impacting it. However, it could also be that around 2012, like we've talked about in past videos, and she talks about a lot, smartphones became ubiquitous across schools, high schools, individuals, just wherever you name it. There are smartphones, and there's social media, and there's digital media. So along with that, that caused more isolation, more insular activity. You're on your phone, you're at home, you're scrolling TikTok. You're not thinking about, oh, I need to go to this dance, I need to go to that. And that's one of those strange things. I think I talked about one of the videos about Gen X, that you think about their experiences and how they're out in the world doing some of these crazy things. In the video, I talked about how there was some Gen X kids were playing in this neighborhood ditch where you had all this sewage water, and they had so much fun doing that. Well, in a world of technology, in the world that Gen Alpha grows up in, that the next generation grows up in, where you're glued to your iPad, there's no shot that they would be playing in some ditch with their friends. Well, that same community-based activity, that same grouping, right, of having fun with your friends, that's something that we're doing less of. And if we're doing less of that, well, the things that come from that, like sexual activity, because that's where you meet people, that's where you network, that's where you meet this girl and you hit it off, right? That's not going to happen as much in a world where most of our activity, most of the things we're interested in, is on the screen. The next couple traits are a bit more political, or culturally political, whatever you want to call it. She talks about how we have more of an interest, Gen Z has more of an interest in restricting speech. So she talks about how in the past there has been this idea of freedom of speech having to do with even protecting hate speech, even protecting racist speech, you name it, it even protects that, okay? That's how many past generations, like the baby boomers, the silents, even many in Gen X, think about it that way. And she talks about how often there is this divide between millennials and Gen Z, thinking that hate speech should not be protected, versus others in past generations thinking that it should. Okay. The other one that she says, I'll go into this a little more in depth in just a second. Another one that she says is interest in emotional and physical safety. So the reason why I'm bringing these up together is because this has to do with basically the same thing, and that is we restrict speech because we're interested in emotional safety and physical safety as well. So I just want to put that out there first. And this is where I want to get some of your opinion, because I think that there's definitely a chance that this book could be a product of its time. Now, that's not to say that she doesn't have evidence and facts for what she's talking about, because that's true. But at the time that she was writing this, maybe circa 2017, 2018, this was much more in the news. The idea of restricting speech, hate speech, college campuses, etc., all of this was much more in the news. Whereas today, I feel like there has been a difference in how Gen Z views speech. I feel quite often, especially with what's happening in Gaza, that many people who have protested about that have felt the downsides of hate speech regulations, the downsides of how that could be interpreted against them, and that among at least some of the more politically active Gen Z, there's been a rethinking of freedom of speech, that maybe it should also include a lot of what people consider to be hate speech as well, because that could be used against us in our protests and the things that we think are valuable. But again, that's just my read of things. I'm really curious to see what you guys think about these couple of topics, because I'm not sure if it's just a product of her time, of what was in the news at the time. Because, like I said, she doesn't have facts to back it up. But my read of the situation is that things have changed, because we are a new generation, we are young people, and so our thoughts of things are not going to be written in stone. They're not going to be set in stone forever. So that's just an interesting question. I want you guys to answer below. The next one that I want to talk about is that we're more racially conscious. What does she mean by that? Well, she talks about how in the 2015 area, there was this event or this time frame on the internet known as the Great Awakening. What do I mean by that? Let me be more specific. Well, the Great Awakening, she says, was when there was a sudden uptick in internet traffic, in Google searches, things like that, when it comes to more racially charged topics, topics like white privilege, topics like that have to do with more feminist ideas, that this happened around the 2015 area. This all culminated in 2021, where all of that internet search traffic was basically at its zenith. It was at its peak. And some of the more important milestones for our generation, things that really impacted us, were the Black Lives Matter protests that happened as a result of George Floyd's murder. So she talked about racial consciousness as being a big factor, a big change that's happened to us as a generation that sets us apart from past generations. Now, for the next one, this is something I've hit on time and time again, and I'm sure many people that talk about Generation Z do, and that is mental health. Now, when it comes to mental health, I'm going to go through it pretty quickly here because I have other videos that go into it in more depth. But she talks about how around 2012, there was this big uptick among our generation with internalizing disorders, things like anxiety and depression. And this feeling of taking the negativity of the world, of how you feel, and pushing it inward and expressing that in an inward fashion versus externalizing on the outward. You're doing something to other people, you're bullying, you're being mean, you're being nasty, right? Like, those are all the things that are externalizing. People, the apex of externalizing behavior would be criminality. It would be you shooting someone, you hurting someone. That would be the apex of externalizing. Now, the opposite end would be hurting ourselves. It would be us using self-harm, using other methods to make ourselves feel terrible. That is what you'd expect with an internalizing disorder. And that's exactly what you've seen over and over again with our generation. Along with this comes more online communication. Rather, in the past, and part of this was just because they didn't have the ability to, but in the past, people would meet with their friends. Teens would meet with their friends in groups. They would go to parties, right? That does not happen nearly as much with Gen Z. Again, like I've hit on before, so many of the things that I hear other generations talk about sounds very foreign. And maybe it's just because, like, I'm some sort of cave dweller, but it's something I've heard among my peers, among my friends, people that I've met, that across our generation, that kind of social community is just not as present as it used to be. It just isn't as widespread. And that's because online communication, because now we can contact our friends via things like FaceTime, via things like Snapchat. And so that need to be in person, even for the people who are more extroverted, those itches can often be scratched from home, doing things at home, playing with your friends on a video game and chatting on Discord, right? That can all be done from your living room versus going to someone else's house where there are 10 or 20 more people that you might not have known, and then having to build those social instincts, those social skills. That's something that I'm afraid we don't have as strong as other generations. Along with this more online communication comes the next point, and that is less physically healthy. Sadly, with our generation, we are more sedentary. We get out less. We do less exercise. We hit the gym less. And with that comes more weight, more obesity, and the early onset of things like diabetes. And I'm afraid with our generation, that has definitely gone up along with more online communication and the rise of these internalizing disorders. The next trait that she hits on is pessimism. Now, considering some of the things that we've talked about, is it any wonder that we're feeling pessimistic? Is it any wonder that we're a little more cynical than the last generation? We're less sexually active. We feel worse about ourselves. We're getting out more and spending less time with friends. We're less physically healthy, right? It shouldn't be any surprise to a lot of people why we're feeling this way. I think personally, now, a lot of people among my generation will disagree with me, but I think there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of positives of the world that we live in. But rather than it being something purely external in the outside world that's making us feel poorly, it's more of our internal world that is at least 80% of the problem, in my view. And that is because of the things we've talked about, because of the way that we're living our life. And by the way, I'm not saying that we're individually to blame. I'm not saying that we're necessarily choosing, but we have been put in a position where the way we live our life is a lot less conducive to being happy, to being joyful, to being optimistic and hopeful about the future. And in that world, of course, we're going to be more pessimistic. But she spotlights in the book that this was even true before COVID, before we were forced into our homes and not to go outside. Even before that, we still had these feelings of pessimism. And that's very, very interesting when you compare that to past generations. The next trait we'll talk about, and again, she does a really good job of having each one flow into each other, and that is the perception of discrimination and an external locus of control. We'll talk about the first part first. She talks about, in this area of the book, that teen girls in particular view colleges as being much more discriminatory and biased against them than even past generations did, when the rate of college education for young women was much lower. So even though they're getting accepted into higher rates, getting degrees at higher rates, they tend to perceive that they're going to be discriminated against higher than past generations who actually were discriminated against. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't any, but it's fascinating when you see the comparison between the two. Now, she points to the Me Too movement as effectively driving this wedge between young women and young men, or young women in the world, allowing them or creating the environment in which they would think that they would have more discrimination against them, even if sometimes that's not the case. Now, let's talk about the second part, an external locus of control. What is an external locus of control? Well, it is this idea that the outside world, other forces, other groups, they have more power in your life than you do. And there's a certain truth to this, of course, but this can be taken way too far, where you don't want to interact with the world, you don't want to engage because you believe that you don't have any power to do so. And it's this spectrum, as it were. And people who believe they have more agency, that believe that their actions can affect the world and affect their life in a positive way, the more they have higher levels of motivation, and they just feel better in general. They're less pessimistic. They're less cynical about the world. They are more happy because they feel like their actions can do something positive, even if it's just in their own world, even if it's just for them. And that's a big difference she spotlights of our generation versus past generations who felt like they had more control, that what they did would fundamentally change their lives and the lives of those around them. The last trait we'll talk about is one that we might even see in the comments section in the future on this video, depending on how many views. I know I'm not getting many views now, but if at some point this particular video hits off, then we'll see this exact thing happen in the comment section. So what is that? And that is political polarization, activism, and voter turnout. So I'm going to group all of these together. Well, that is, among our generation, there seems to be increasing polarization, increasing extremes of both sides. That conservatives are way more conservative. They have much stronger beliefs, and they hold them more strongly than the past. That they're not able to listen to other people, and that more leftist spectrum feel the same way. And there's this increasing division. So when you look at the aggregate on the whole, when you look at all the data, it might seem like, oh, well, it's about the same. But in reality, that doesn't really account for the truth. And that is that on the spectrum, there's more people on the right and there's more people on the left. than there used to be. There used to be more people on the center, more people who were moderates, and yet with our generation, there seems to be a lot more polarization and extremes. Now, personally, I totally understand why that's the case, and that is in a world in which you can dive into whatever topic, whatever idiosyncratic idea that you have, you can go headfirst into it. You can know more than anyone else. Well, in that world, if you're interested in politics, then you're going to know more, you're going to be plugged in more to whatever that niche topic, niche political topic might be, whether that be the war in Gaza, LGBT issues, or it be immigration. It could be any of these things, but you can know as much as you can about that. You can follow every political pundit, every person who takes that topic seriously. You can do that because of social media, because of digital media in general and the internet. Whereas the past, you couldn't do that. And so the things that you hear would have been the more moderate in between. It would have been more of a consensus view because you're not able to dive into the extreme. Because extremes are often found when you have more information. And now that we have more information, those extremes can be drilled into like never before. Well, along with that has become more political activism. We've seen more protests among young people, and we've also seen more voter turnout among young people than the past. Now, I think the 2024 election was a little different, but at least in the 2021 that she talks about and 2016, there was a much bigger turnout among our generation than past would have predicted. The final trait we're going to talk about is shaped by the pandemic, is how she terms it. And what does she mean by that? Well, she sees the pandemic as being this catalyst that has amplified many of the traits of our generation. For instance, we'll take isolation and less interaction in real life. Well, how did the pandemic interact with that? Well, we all know we were shut in our homes, we couldn't go anywhere, and in many cases, we were fearful for the lives of our family or our own lives. And because at the beginning, we had no clue what was even going on. We had no clue about the severity of what was going on. And different people reacted in way different ways. We had some people who wanted to go outside the next day, right? But we had many other people who took that fear to heart, and it really stuck with them in a way that I think changed them going forward. So that's just one example of how the impact of COVID-19 magnified these other traits that we're talking about. But it's also true for things like remote work. Past generations, the boomers for instance, would never even have imagined of a world in which your first job might be in your living room, working on your computer. Now, to be fair, many boomers would not have imagined much, but regardless, that still is a huge change that COVID-19 and the effect of the pandemic magnified to a large extent. So that was a look into our generation and how Jean Twenge, the #1 expert, sees our generation, the traits we have, and how things like technology, the slow life strategy, and individualism has impacted our generation, being the newest one. So I really want to see how this impacts your life. Are these traits true for you? Do they also represent who you are and different aspects of your friend group? I would love to hear how you think that they're true or false. Because again, at the end of the day, this is her perspective on the data that she's seen. Now, the data might be true, but how she's interpreting, how she's bringing it together, that might not necessarily be true. And even so, even if it was true when she put out the book, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true today. Like I said, we're a young generation. We're still developing, changing, and growing. And so if that's how it was in the past, it doesn't necessarily mean that's how it's going to be in the future. So thanks for looking into it with me, and I'll see you in the next one.